Welcome to Week 2, Part 3. Let's say that you wish to develop a Visual Basic 2010 application that has the following basic features. There's one screen with an image of a computer. The user can select 3 terms displayed on 3 separate buttons. The definition of each term will appear after each button is clicked. When a selection is made, the previous definition is cleared, and an exit button will allow the program to be terminated. The first task is to obtain an image of a computer for use on the form. You can search Google for free image of a computer or a similar search. Be certain not to use copyrighted images or even coding in any of your applications. Be sure to save the image to a working location so that it can be easily accessed during the development process. Now that we have an image to use, let's open Visual Studio 2010 Express and start a new application. Be sure to select Windows Forms application from the installed templates. Let's call this application Visual Basic 2010 Terms. Note that I am not using spaces in the application name. This is a recommended practice in order to ensure that there will be no issues with referencing the application name later. You will also see this practice used throughout the course when naming other objects. Now that we have created a new application, let's refer to the general basic requirements and create the user interface. When gathering such requirements, it may even be that someone has already sketched the user interface on paper, and you are to simply recreate it on a Windows form. It may also be the case that you have free rein to design the user interface. Hopefully, throughout the course, you will gain an appreciation for simple, clean, and user-friendly designs. Always think about the audience that will be using the interface and put yourself in their position. In other words, think about what you would expect in terms of a user-friendly and simple application. Also, consider color and font choices and the effect they can have on the users of your applications. With the application open, the first thing to do is ensure the toolbox is visible. To enable this, go to View, Other Windows, and choose the toolbox. Be sure that the pin cushion is set to keep it in place during the design phase. Next, let's change the name property of the form to something meaningful. We do this by selecting the form object and changing the name property to Form Visual Basic 2010 Terms. Note that the convention of naming forms starts with FRM is used. While we are at it, let's also change the form1.vb name to Form Visual Basic 2010 Terms.vb in the Solution Explorer. Then change the name of the text property to Visual Basic 2010 terms so that the form has a meaningful description. Next, add the image that was downloaded previously. In order to do this, we have to add a picture box object to the form. This object will allow the image to be embedded in the form. From the toolbox, drag and drop a picture box object to the form. With Picture Box Object selected, click on the tiny arrow indicator that will open up the Picture Box Tasks box. From here, select Choose Image and then select Local Resource in the Import option. You can then navigate to the image file that was previously downloaded. After selecting the image, ensure that the size mode is normal. At this point, it may be necessary to resize both the form object and the image object so that the image is completely visible. With any Visual Basic 2010 object, to resize, simply select the object, point to a handle of the object, hold down the mouse, and drag until the object is resized to the desired size. This may of course require both the height and width to be adjusted in this manner. It is also possible to reposition an object entirely by clicking the object in its interior, holding down the mouse button, and then dragging the object to the desired location. Do not spend a considerable amount of time at this point resizing and positioning objects, as other objects will be placed on the form and it will be necessary to repeat these actions to ensure all objects are placed and sized properly in relation to each other. With the picture box object selected, note that its name property needs to be changed to something meaningful. The reason this is so important is that meaningful names allow for objects to be easily referenced in coding. This will become increasingly apparent when we add code to our form. Let's change the name property to Pick Computer. Notice that the prefix PIC is used for a picture box object. Next, let's add a label object to the form that reads Visual Basic 2010 terms. To accomplish this, drag and drop a label object from the toolbox to the form. With the label object selected, change its name property to label Visual Basic 2010 Terms. Notice that when this change is made, that the actual caption is not changed yet. This is because we have not yet set the text property of the label. To do this, scroll down to the text property in the Properties box and type Visual Basic 2010 Terms. Notice that when this is done, the font size is quite small and should be changed to be more readable. To change the font properties, find the font property and expand it to see the options available. This should look very familiar to properties you have set in word processing applications, such as Microsoft Word. Let's change a few of the properties. Notice that some of the properties, such as bold and italic, are by default set to false, and we can set them to true to enable them. These are called Boolean properties because they can be true or false. Next, let's add 4 buttons that represent 3 Visual Basic 2010 terms and the exit button. We will drag and drop 4 button objects from the toolbox. Notice the guidelines that appear to help with the relative alignment of objects as they are placed onto the form object. This is a great feature that is relatively new to the Visual Studio IDE. You can always go back after all objects are placed onto the form and finalize the sizing and positioning of these. However, this feature helps you to very quickly place objects in positions that are fairly aligned. This feature is one more way in which the IDE greatly contributes to rapid application development. We will now set the following properties for the button objects. Button 1 will set the name to BTN Computer Hardware and the text property to Computer Hardware. For button 2, let's set the name property to BTN Developer and the text property to Developer. For button 3, let's set the name property to BTN Rapid Application Development and the text property to Rapid Application Development. And for button 4, let's set the name property to BTN Exit and the text property to Exit Window. Note that it is necessary to resize the button objects to allow for the text to be visible. It is recommended that all buttons be sized to the same height and width. This is easily accomplished by selecting a button object that represents the size that should be shared by the remaining buttons and then going to the Format, Make Same Size Both option. Thus, all the buttons will now be selected and the action taken to ensure they are the same size. Similar actions can be taken to align objects to the left, right, or middle. Again, you may have used similar features when aligning text in word processing programs such as Word. Next, we will add 3 label objects to the form that will hold the actual text of the terms that will be appearing when each of the button objects are clicked. We will now set the following properties of the label objects. Label 1. We'll set the name property to LBL, to computer hardware definition. And we'll set the text property to physical equipment associated with the computer. For label 2, we'll set the name property to LBL developer definition and the text property to a person skilled in designing computer programs and implementing them in programming languages. For label 3, we'll set the name property to LBL Rapid Application Development Definition and the text property to the process of using pre-built classes to make application development faster, easier, and more reliable. Again, note that it is necessary to resize the objects to allow for the text to be visible. Now that we have established the name and text properties of the essential objects needed for this application, we will return back to the general requirements in order to complete the coding behind these objects. The first thing to note is that initially the definitions will not be visible until the respective button is clicked. This means that we need to change the visible property of each label object from true to false. Also, key to this application is that the coding necessary behind each button object that will change the visibility of its corresponding label object from false to true, while also ensuring that the visibility property of the other label objects is set to false so that only one definition at a time is displayed. So let us double click on the BTN computer hardware object to enter into its subroutine. Let's first add the coding to change the visible property of its corresponding label object to true. Next, we will set the visible property of the other label objects to false. Let's now repeat the process for the remaining objects, making the appropriate changes to establish the visibility of their corresponding labels. Note that we get back to the design mode simply by clicking on the Design tab. The coding from the first button can also be copied and pasted into the other button subroutines and adjusted accordingly. Now we can add coding to the BTN exit object to exit the application. Note that me refers to the form object, and we are calling the close function that will then take care of the details of closing the application. Now that we've added all the necessary coding, let's save, build, and debug the application to test its functionality. Since this is a relatively simple application, full-scale testing is not necessary. You will see, however, as more functionality and complex coding is developed, that test scenarios must be established to allow applications to be fully tested and ensure they are properly debugged. Now that functionality has been confirmed, one final task would be to ensure that all objects are sized and positioned so that the overall look and feel of the application is user-friendly and easy on the eyes.